Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Emily, and I'm on the events team here. And as always, we are really pleased to partner with Literati Bookstore in bringing us so many great events. So tonight's event is with Andrew Eyport, who is author of Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. He is professor of history at Wayne State University, and just a topic I know very little about, I'll just say broadly, specializing in post-war Germany. That's about as much as I'll go into there. So we are going to have a lecture followed by a Q&A. I will be running around the room with a microphone. We are live streaming this event tonight, so we want to make sure that any questions the audience have get set into the microphone, so that gets picked up for folks who are listening online. And then after the Q&A, we will have a signing. So Literati is out in the vestibule area selling books, so you can grab a book at any point in the event, and then we'll be doing the signing over there at that table. And with that, I will welcome Professor Port to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for the kind introduction. Grateful to the library for having me here, to Literati Bookstore, to all of you who've come. My family from New Jersey came all the way up to hear this, so it's very exciting for me. Lecture sounds very stiff, so I'm not so sure it's a lecture. It's more of a, I'll start off by giving you a sense of the book. It's kind of a modified reading, and then I'll talk about the questions that I deal with in the book and that really moved me to write this book. All right, let's get started. Let me set the stage. This is Sarajevo, several months after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords that ended the war in Bosnia. Departing Serb forces, in a final act of vengeful spite, are setting aflame any structure still standing after the 4-year siege of the Bosnian capital. Dr. Rupert Neudeck spends the day with his son Marcel in a residential section of the city, breaking down doors and rushing into burning buildings to save the lives of elderly Muslims. The winter of 1996 is a cold one, and Dr. Neudeck is taking yet another holiday with his immediate family in an active war zone. It's his third time there since news first broke about genocidal ethnic cleansing, mass rapes, and the setting up of concentration camps in the Balkans. That evening, the renowned German journalist and humanitarian sits quietly in a Bosnian friend's apartment reading, out of necessity by candlelight, a book about the Wehrmacht's occupation of Poland a half-century earlier. Waking to the sound of explosions early the next day, he looks out the window at all the destruction in the street below. Quote, "That was precisely how I imagined early mornings in the Warsaw Ghetto," he later recalled. There are olfactory reminders of the past as well. The road that, quote, smelled of genocide near Srebrenica, for instance, or the, quote, treacly foul stench of decaying corpses in Kigali. Yes, Rupert Neudeck had also been in Rwanda during the genocidal rampage of 1994, and that was no coincidence. Over the previous decade and a half, he'd frequently been among the first German volunteers to arrive in trouble spots across the globe, organizing dozens of humanitarian missions from Southeast Asia to Southeastern Europe. Most of this work was done on the side as a shoestring operation of sorts during vacation or on nights and weekends with his wife, Crystal, whom you see here, in their modest townhouse on the outskirts of Cologne. That's where I visited Rupert Neudeck to find out why he had chosen to go to places like Mogadishu instead of Mallorca, a preferred vacation spot for most middle-class Germans. Neudeck, you get a better sense of it, and this is yeah, and when I met him, that's what he looked like, this dashing figure here. He cut a dashing figure, gaunt, weathered face, neatly trimmed white beard. He had the air of a sea captain, though he was often mistaken for a medical doctor, an understandable error given all the medical assistance he had brought to Asia and Africa over the years. He was, in fact, a doctor of philosophy. Born in Danzig on the eve of World War II, Neudeck had fled westward with his mother and siblings away from the Red Army in the waning months of the war. He studied law as a young man and served as a Jesuit novice, but then he decided to change course and write a doctoral thesis on the political ethics of the French existential philosophers Sartre and Camus. After completing his degree, Neudeck took a different career path once again, beginning work in 1977 as a journalist and editor at West Germany's premier public radio station. He and his wife, he later told me, were leading a, quote, perfectly bourgeois life at the time. That all changed in February 1979, during a trip he took to Paris to collect material for a new book on Sartre. It was there that Neudeck met with the renowned French philosopher André Glucksmann, whom you see here on the right. Glucksmann was the first to speak with him at length about the dire situation of the so-called boat people in Southeast Asia. Their plight had just broken as a major news story several months earlier. Que faites-vous? Glucksmann greeted Neudeck in the cafe where they met. What was he personally going to do about the refugees? Neudeck had similarly memorable meetings with Sartre himself and with Bernard Kouchner, whom you see here on the left, the future French foreign minister who had founded Doctors Without Borders in 1971. You see here Kouchner with a young Vietnamese child, a boat person, whom he had helped to save along with other French. They chartered a boat called a bateau pour le Vietnam, a ship for Vietnam, and went to the South China Sea to rescue as many people as they could. Well, inspired by that, inspired by the three men, Neudeck returned to Germany intent on doing his part to help refugees from the region who were stranded and dying on the high seas. That decision had a great deal to do with Neudeck's own personal history. On January 30th, 1945, during their flight from Danzig, he and his family arrived in the Baltic port city of Gotenhafen, where they saw a large cruise ship in the harbor, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which you see here on the left. Originally built in the mid-1930s for the Nazi leisure movement, Strength Through Joy, or Kraft durch Freude, the ship was now being used to evacuate German officials, civilians, and refugees from the advancing Soviet army. Neudeck's mother did not have tickets for the Gustloff. She wouldn't have taken a, quote, luxury ship for Nazi bigwigs anyway, he later insisted. And they wound up on board a coal steamer instead. That was our savior, he later told me. Later that day, a Soviet submarine sank the Gustloff, and thousands of its passengers drowned in the freezing waters of the Baltic. The news quickly reached him and his family, and horrific images of the disaster left an indelible impression on the 5-year-old. That was why Neudeck believed death by drowning became such an important archetype in his life and a major motivation for his later relief efforts. Thanks to a flood of donations, Neudeck was able to charter and outfit a decommissioned Dutch freighter, the Cap en Amour. By the summer of 1982, the ship had rescued almost 10,000 boat people, most of whom were later allowed to seek refuge in the Federal Republic, in West Germany. The group became best known at the time for this perilous undertaking, but its activities were not limited to saving the lives of those fleeing by sea. Neudeck also sent teams of German doctors and nurses to the Thai-Cambodian border to assist Cambodian refugees who had just survived the Khmer Rouge genocide. Here on the left, you see him this is Neudeck, young Neudeck hoisting a sign for the refugee camp, and here he is aboard the Cap en Amour with some of the children that he helped to save. Their work in the refugee camps relied on the generous support of private citizens and German celebrities, including the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Heinrich Böll. Equally essential was the engagement of hundreds of West Germans who volunteered for stints of 4 to 8 weeks. This included one nurse from the German capital at the time, from Bonn, who decided to volunteer instead of taking a ski vacation that year, and who, she later explained, worked for 5 weeks, quote, under the most primitive conditions. Those are her words. To be effective, Neudeck believed, volunteers had to live together with the people, without any showers or other niceties. Quote, experiencing hardship and physically sharing their everyday reality is crucial for aid work. One detects here the Christian impulse behind this former Jesuit novice's activities, and perhaps his scholarly interest in existential philosophy as well. A childhood trauma, a Catholic upbringing, and a fortuitous visit to Paris in the winter of 1979. These were the 3 main influences that first spurred Rupert Neudeck into action. And when I sat with him decades later in a living room filled to the brim with foreign art and other artifacts he had collected from abroad over the years, the conversation eventually turned to why his volunteers did what they did. They had endless motivations, he surmised, but there was most certainly a very great collective willingness on the part of his fellow Germans to do, quote, more for humanitarian issues than all other European nationalities. And that most certainly had to do with the past. But which past exactly? His own motivation, he readily acknowledged, had been his traumatic experiences as a child refugee. But what about the suffering the Germans had caused, and not the suffering that they had experienced themselves? Nazi crimes against humanity, and the Jews in particular, had played a, quote, powerful role, he believed, adding that his organization's activities were a, quote, semi-conscious attempt to compensate somehow for this past, to portray Germany, quote, a little bit differently in the world. And when it came to humanitarian actions, German volunteers always did more than Europeans, than other Europeans, he insisted, because they didn't want to be surpassed in their efforts. This was, after all, one area where they were, quote, allowed to be on top of the world. Several weeks after meeting with Rupert Neudeck, I spoke with Helmut Schmidt about his government's response to the Cambodian genocide. The former West German chancellor had come under attack in the late 1970s for not doing enough to help the refugees in Indochina. What happened tens of thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia did not threaten West Germany in any way, he bluntly told me, and the genocide in Cambodia, quote, didn't concern us. Almost all Asian countries committed acts that, quote, violated morality, he huffily added, but this was simply not, quote, our affair. It was interesting the way he phrased that. He said, es war nicht unser Bier, it wasn't our beer, it wasn't our affair. The Federal Republic's vital interests came before moral and humanitarian considerations, he continued, and in the realm of foreign affairs, those interests consisted almost exclusively of the existential threat posed by Soviet nuclear weapons stationed in Eastern Europe. Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, whom you see here on the right, with Schmidt in the center, and of course Henry Kissinger on the left. Genscher had a similar take at the time. The foreign minister, annoyed by repeated requests for information about the Cambodian genocide, wanted to know why some West German politicians were placing, quote, so much value on this issue anyway. Well, whatever reservations the two men may have had, their country would take in almost 14,000 refugees from Indochina by the spring of 1980. And here are some of them arriving at the airport, I believe, in Frankfurt. That was the highest number, 14,000 compared to the total number of refugees was a drop in the bucket, but it was the highest number among Western nations without special ties to the region, such as the United States and France, which had recently waged bitter wars there. By way of explanation, West German officials pointed to their own countries' bitter experiences involving mass flight and expulsion in the 1940s and 1950s. Genscher himself had fled communist East Germany as a young man. But as the number of refugees skyrocketed worldwide beginning in the late 1970s, and with it, the number of people applying for asylum in the Federal Republic, the initial willingness to welcome those poor souls fleeing war-torn regions quickly gave way to angry resentment about foreign frauds supposedly taking advantage of German generosity. Two contrasting sets of responses then to one of the world's most terrific genocides since the systematic murder of the European Jews in the 1940s. Copious concern, bountiful largesse, apparent indifference and acrimonious backlash, responses that prefigure in many ways developments in today's Federal Republic. Since 2015, the xenophobic far right has enjoyed a political resurgence there in the wake of Chancellor Angela Merkel's controversial decision that year to welcome more than 1 million refugees from Africa and the Middle East. Both developments drew global attention to Germany, but neither Merkel's largesse, her generosity, nor the backlash, the xenophobic backlash that are brought in its wake, should have been a surprise, at least not to those familiar with the story of what Germans have talked about and done in response to genocide and other mass suffering in foreign lands since 1945. And that is the subject of my book. I always feel self-conscious drinking water because my daughter sitting in the front row here told me I look very shaky when I'm drinking out of something. So I hope I'm not shaking too much. Okay. There are few countries more haunted by the darker aspects of their recent history than Germany. 75 years after the end of World War II, the barbaric crimes committed by the Nazis continue to cast a long shadow at home and abroad, coloring perceptions and self-perceptions of the country and its people. Yet the story of how Germans managed to put their violent, genocidal past behind them in practice and create a stable and prosperous democracy, reluctant to use force and committed to the defense of human rights, that's an equally important and gripping tale. If the driving question about the years prior to 1945 had long been a disheartening one, where did Germany go wrong? The period since the war, since 1945, presents a different puzzle. How and why did Germany go right? Never Again, my book, tackles these questions in a roundabout way, using German responses to mass murder in other lands to understand how the weight of the past shaped beliefs and influenced actual behavior in the post-war present. And I consciously chose this indirect approach, German reactions to foreign genocides, because I hope to present a less stilted picture of German memory work, of how they deal with the past. Now, there are many abstract theories about the nature and significance of collective memory. But to my mind, its true importance lies in its consequences, in its tangible effects on actual attitudes and actions. And that's why I focus in my book less on solemn statements by high-level officials, the usual approach to German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, and more on the concrete acts that came in response to reports of foreign genocide decades after the final solution. To get at these issues, I specifically look at German responses to the 3 infamous genocides that took place in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. That choice is important, I think, because it lays bare evolving reactions to mass murder during a period of drastic change, from the height of the Cold War, when 2 German states still existed, to the period following unification, from a time when few Germans showed much interest in the Holocaust to one when few topics generated as much public attention as the genocide of the European Jews. The precise timing of these genocides is also significant. By chance, a conspicuous spike in interest about the fate of the European Jews coincided with the genocide in Cambodia. In fact, the Khmer Rouge were driven from power the very month the American miniseries Holocaust aired on West German television in January 1979. That was a sensational media event. You see the cover here on the left of Der Spiegel. That's kind of, I would say, a better version of, a more serious journalistic version of our Time magazine, although Spiegel based itself on Time originally. You see here this cover story about the miniseries that was shown. That sensational media event, and I don't have the figures in my head, but I think something like 1/3 of all Germans saw at least one, West Germans saw at least one episode of the series when it aired in January '79. That sensational media event initiated a public fixation on the final solution at precisely the point in time when firsthand details about the carnage in Cambodia began to emerge. And it fundamentally influenced German responses to the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. And in turn, it affected how Germans spoke and thought about their own past. That became especially clear, I think, during the infamous historians' quarrel of the mid-1980s, the so-called Historikerstreit. That was a fierce public debate that decade between German progressives and conservatives about the uniqueness and causes of what now increasingly became known as the Holocaust. And I wanted to point out this book here on the right, Holocaust and Cambodia, that was a collection of essays by reports by two journalists of the Spiegel. The fact that they chose Holocaust for the title, I think, really speaks volumes. You know, if that had appeared several years earlier, it's doubtful they would have used that precise term. There are other good reasons for beginning in the 1970s. This was the decade when global interest in human rights reemerged. It was also when the worldwide flow of refugees reached unprecedented proportions, a development that had a major impact on German responses to foreign genocide. Yes, it stimulated humanitarian efforts to relieve mass suffering abroad, like Rupert Neudeck and his activities, but at the same time, it stoked fears about letting in too many foreigners, especially supposedly bogus ones, supposedly coming to Germany for purely venal reasons. Now, few issues have enlivened and politicized public debate of late as much as immigration, and of course not just in the Federal Republic, as we in the United States are well aware. My book then draws attention to two contradictory impulses since the 1970s. Rampant fear, anger, and resentment about overburdening and, quote, excessive foreignization, what the Germans call Überfremdung, and a widespread desire, even compulsion for some because of Germany's past, to help the less fortunate. A look at German reactions to genocide during the first half of the 1990s takes our story into the period after the Cold War, and thus into a much different geopolitical context. Germany's unexpected unification in 1990 not only marked the end of 4 decades of division, but it also transformed the country's international position. The restoration of full sovereignty meant that the country now had greater freedom for maneuver, as well as greater international responsibilities, and its responses to the twin genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda show how this dramatically reconfigured the country's foreign policy, as well as its relationship with a now more distant past. The Federal Republic's changed standing in the world gave rise to a great deal of anguish and hand-wringing at the time. Would unified Germany remain a tamed power, or to revert to its dangerous and destructive ways of yore? Had the country truly learned the lessons of its history? The question of what those lessons were became a great source of vexed debate in the shadow of genocidal atrocities in the Balkans, where unified Germany faced its most significant challenge abroad since unification, whether to participate in joint international military efforts aimed at stopping genocide and other human rights abuses on foreign soil. This confronted Germans with difficult choices that threw into disarray the old post-war consensus on foreign policy and the non-use of force. Even renowned pacifists like Joschka Fischer, who you see here on the right, a former student radical and future foreign minister, came down on the side of what was increasingly referred to as humanitarian intervention. If anyone is interested during the Q&A, I have a kind of amusing story about Joschka Fischer that I'd be happy to share with you, but somebody has to ask, otherwise we'll just skip over it. My initial interest in German responses to foreign genocide came in the summer of 1992, when I first heard reports that Serbs had set up concentration camps in Bosnia. I was living in Germany at the time, and I vividly recall television images like these of emaciated men with shaved heads standing behind barbed wire. The images resonated for obvious reasons, and I distinctly recall thinking that this could not be true. There could not be concentration camps in Europe in 1992. I also recall a great deal of skepticism in Germany as well, as policymakers, public figures, and the media struggled to come up with a proper response. Never again Auschwitz or never again war. And those two slogans, never again Auschwitz, never again war, they encapsulated the harrowing dilemma that many Germans faced after learning about the genocidal atrocities taking place in Bosnia. Should their country, because of its past, stand by and do nothing in response to reports of yet another genocide, this time only a day's drive from Berlin? Or should they participate in international interventions intended to stop the mass slaughter by force? The story of how Germans confronted their past and the concrete responses that had in response to mass atrocities abroad, it's a highly relevant story that is arguably as worthy of our interest as the darker topics in modern German history. Right? The focus on Nazism and the Holocaust is understandable, of course, but the attention my book devotes to the admirable and often uplifting actions of Germans from all walks of life offers other countries with difficult pasts, including the United States, a master class in coming to terms with the more sinister aspects of their own history, especially at a moment when many seem to fear the United States might go the way Germany did in the 1930s. Looking to the Germans for inspiration reinforces a widespread tendency to see post-war Western Germany as a success story. Now, there are good reasons for questioning that simple but uplifting narrative, which downplays the less sanguine aspects of Germany's post-war history, right? Racism, sexism, wealth disparities, environmental degradation. Still, even with that caveat in mind, and even when not measured against the horrible foil of Nazi Germany, the Federal Republic was indeed a success story, a place where Germans effectively put their violent, once genocidal past behind them. And their response to genocides in foreign lands are an untold aspect of that story. Now, it is true that those responses did not do much to prevent genocide. They were more reactive than active, even when it was taking place in their own backyard in the Balkans. And despite their obligations as an early signatory of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. But my book doesn't take a normative or prescriptive approach. What I mean by that, it's not a j'accuse of what Germans should have done in the face of genocide. America's former ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, has written an important book about American responses to genocide in the 20th century. And that is more of a j'accuse. It's an indictment of the failure of the United States to act. That's not what I do. My book explores instead the parameters of the possible for post-war Germany, given the weight of the past and its own international position before and after 1989. Hardly anyone, least of all the Germans themselves, would have wished or expected East or West Germany to take military action abroad. Now, that would change drastically after reunification, and that transformation, along with the stormy domestic debates unleashed by the decision to intervene militarily in Bosnia, are central themes of my book. And by the way, it goes without saying, they're also themes that are very much still pertinent today in light of the war in Ukraine. Now, this point that no one expected Germans to take military action abroad, it's an important one. It's an important one because it moves the conversation beyond moralistic condemnations of inaction, beyond the writing of history as what I like to call politics by other means. For most countries, grand actions involving military force are extremely difficult or simply not possible. And that's why I focus instead on what German officials and citizens could and did do short of sending combat troops, providing various forms of humanitarian assistance, for example, welcoming large numbers of refugees to Germany, exerting diplomatic pressure behind the scenes, and enforcing economic sanctions. Reports of mass atrocities goaded Germans into action, in short, and what they did went far beyond high-sounding speeches meant to atone for past atrocities. And that's significant because it reveals a great deal about German values, mentalities, and lessons learned after 1945. Lessons that should be of interest to Americans, I think, searching for effective ways to reckon with the more sordid aspects of their own country's past. What has struck me repeatedly about German reactions to foreign genocide is that the legacies and lessons of the Third Reich and the Holocaust were not at all clear-cut. The difficult choice between never again Auschwitz and never again war captures just how ambivalent the burden of history could be. In fact, as my book shows again and again, Germany's violent past could be and was used to draw diametrically opposed conclusions about the proper response to reports of foreign genocide. Those who tended to see Germany's hands tied because of its history, who spoke of a quote, duty to nonviolence because of Nazi atrocities, they met with equally heartfelt counter-arguments by those who pointed to their country's past as an injunction to act. Quote, we have a political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history. This was a quote from a speech that Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel gave to some colleagues in 1995, just 2 weeks, by the way, before the genocidal massacre at Srebrenica. He continued, it was, after all, the Allies who, using military force, by the way, freed us from the Nazi dictatorship. Now, if the Third Reich has taught anything, it's perhaps that there are no easy answers to these debates. But my book draws attention to something just as important. The mass suffering caused by Germans was not necessarily the past that mattered most. As Rupert Neudeck's story teaches us, Neudeck, the gentleman I began my talk with, the suffering that Germans experienced themselves, their profound sense of victimhood, could be equally motivational, and so could perceptions of political and even economic self-interest. In fact, my book shows how these debates about proper responses to genocide were used over and over to score points against domestic political rivals, with progressives accusing conservatives of supporting humanitarian military intervention in hopes of one day restoring Germany's status as a great power, as a Großmacht. Those on the right responded in kind, asking why the left had remained silent as Cambodian communists butchered millions. What these debates also show is that most conservatives confronted and took responsibility for Germany's past as seriously as their opponents on the left. That's an important and often overlooked legacy of the progressive political upheavals of the late 1960s, when Nazi crimes became, for almost all Germans, regardless of political outlook, the measure of all things evil. The willingness of conservative Germans to countenance their country's difficult past and draw important lessons from it distinguishes them from many of their counterparts in the United States, who seem disinclined to confront, much less take responsibility for, the history and legacy of American racism. But it should also serve as a sign of encouragement that such efforts need not be politically exclusive or one-sided, and nor should remorse. There's perhaps another lesson here for American audiences, and I'll end with this: what to avoid when confronting the past. After 2 decades of deafening silence about the Holocaust after the war, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction beginning in the 1960s, producing an almost obsessive public preoccupation with the dark side of Germany's past. That eventually produced an angry backlash, even on the part of those who can in no way be considered to be apologists for the Third Reich. I refer to Germans, even on the left, who complain that the political and moralistic use of negative memories about the Nazi past has been used as a high-handed moral cudgel against political enemies. Well, my book shows how these very disputes dominated public discussion about genocide in foreign lands, fueling accusations that foreign atrocities were being used to relativize Germany's own earlier crimes. And this played out in the very way that language was used. Heated debates about the appropriateness of referring to Serb prison compounds in Bosnia as concentration camps, which is one example of this. One, of course, that had eerie reverberations in recent debates in the US about the use of that charged term to describe holding facilities for immigrants on our own southern border. The point is that Americans can indeed learn from the Germans about confronting their own checkered past. But those lessons, I would argue, are ambivalent. The need to achieve a balance between too little and too much, to strike a proper tone that doesn't give rise to nastier recriminations and indignant backlash, that is, I think, perhaps the most important lesson the Germans can teach us. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to go into our Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I will come to you with the mic.
Thanks, Andrew. That was really great.
Thank you.
You started off with this description of Neudeck's, driven by his moral conscience, and then you talked about Schmidt and Genscher not really caring much about what was going on in Cambodia, or not willing to act. And that sort of highlights this tension between politicians and, say, citizens, and this tension between politics and the moral questions you raise here. I'm really interested in understanding better how this whole debate evolved in Germany, not just in the political echelon, but within the people, and how that, those discussions amongst the people affected the politicians, and how that all, eventually turned into what it did.
Well, you have to buy the book to, no. It's a wonderful question. One of the most difficult parts of this book was getting at what quote unquote ordinary Germans thought about these genocides and other atrocities abroad. Just as difficult would be to trace exactly how, say, public opinion affected decision-making. I mean, I certainly came across in the archives letters that were written by ordinary citizens to German politicians and other officials saying they have to do something to help these people. But I guess I would argue that the greatest influence, and this became clear to me over and over again, was the role of the media. What journalists had to say, what they drew attention to, And if you consider journalists ordinary Germans, then I guess that's partly an answer to your question. But it was very clear to me that it was often what was appearing in the German everyday press and on television that influenced the responses by the politicians.
I'm just wondering if you have any amusing anecdotes about German foreign ministers.
Oh, you know, I did interviews with about, I don't know, 60 Germans for this book. And one of the people I really wanted to interview was Joschka Fischer, the foreign minister. And I sent him many emails. I sent his personal assistant many emails, and they all went unanswered. So, I had not been in Germany for 7 years. I was there in 2016. This past June, I went back for the first time in 7 years. A friend picked me up at the airport. I needed to get some money, so she took me to an ATM in Berlin. And I opened the door, I'm about to go in, and I noticed somebody behind me. And I look around, and sure enough, it was Joschka Fischer. He realized that I recognized him, so he kind of looked down right away and didn't want to be bothered. But I said, Fischer. I said, it's me, Andrew Port. No reaction. I said, I said what I just said to you. I said, I sent you dozens of emails. You didn't respond. No response whatsoever. So then I said, well, I just published a book about German responses to genocide, and you play a very prominent role in this book. I'd like to send you a copy. He hasn't said a word up to this point. He looks at me and goes, so at that point, he went to get his money, and I went to get my money. He was faster than I was. He was leaving. He passed me by, and have a nice day. And I said, thank you, you too. And I'm walking out, and there's a woman also at another ATM, and I said to her, do you know who that was? And she said, yeah, of course. And I told her the story, I wrote this book, and, and she looks at me and she says, well, look, if he doesn't want a copy, you can send it to me. Anyway, that was my amusing, yeah. No, I have a good friend who's a journalist, a rather prominent journalist who knows Fischer very well. In fact, Fischer wrote an important open letter in late July 1995 calling on the Green Party, the pacifist Green Party, to finally get behind using military measures to stop the Serbs in Bosnia, which caused, a great deal of, anger and uproar. But he began that open letter with a quote from this acquaintance of mine, Michael Thumann, who writes for a weekly newspaper called Die Zeit, and he started with that. So he knows Thumann, they're I wouldn't say they're friends, but they know each other. And I wrote to this friend and I asked him, I said, can you explain this behavior? Because it's strange. You would think there would be a little interest there. And he said he just wants to have nothing now to do with politics. He opened a consulting firm in Berlin, and I guess he's now making just lots of money. He's got to pay for his Armani suit somehow. He used, this is somebody who in the early 70s was beating up, policemen on the streets of Frankfurt. And then 30 years later, 20-something years later, he's wearing, three-piece suits, running in marathons, and serving as foreign minister of Germany. It's really quite an evolution.
Yeah, thank you for this talk, and I'm sure your book will spur a debate when it will be translated into German.
Do you know someone? No.
Well, maybe after this. I was just wondering, I mean, you started up with Rupert Neudeck, and of course he is, as a person, immensely important and also interesting. However, and I don't want to exaggerate my role, you know, having, you know, consciously followed much of these events, I think Biafra was really the start of a kind of a, you emphasized the role of images and the role of the press. And Biafra was really the moment where, after the war, for the first time, you saw starving children and horrible images. And it was, not the least, the moment where these two organizations, I mean, Ärzte, Médecins Sans Frontières und Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker, were founded in the aftermath. So this was served like, you know, the institutionalization of this humanitarian civil society engagement.
Yeah.
Another point came to me when you showed the image of Schmidt and Genscher. And don't forget the guy who sat next to him, Kissinger.
Yeah.
So I think the question, I mean, I think it's great that your book points not just to the discourses and the civil society, but also to the policymakers. Mm-hmm. But the policymakers had pretty much tied hand, and they still have, because
That's
I think
right.
one of the lessons learned from the past in German politics was multilateralism.
Yes.
Never go alone. And they couldn't go alone vis-a-vis Cambodia. They couldn't go alone vis-a-vis ex-Yugoslavia. And they couldn't go alone vis-a-vis the Ukraine. So I think that was one of the, I mean, in a different level of politics, that was one of the lessons from the past, was the tying into the European Union, into NATO, into the United Nations resolution, and all that. So yeah, those were the 2 points that came.
Yeah, and again, you know, a point that I tried to make is that I'm not suggesting that the Germans, even the German government, should have done more than it did, sending troops or whatever. There was only one person at the time in the West who was calling for Western troops to be sent to Cambodia. Does anyone want to hazard a guess who that was? George McGovern, of all people. Yeah, who had ran in 1972 against Nixon on ending the war, but he believed that the troops should be sent in there. No, you know, as Schmidt said to me when we spoke, it's pretty well known that he had a very tense relationship with Jimmy Carter. And he said to me, he said, I had enough problems with Carter at the time than to, that was about another interest. You talk about multilateralism. Yes, West Germany, that's been an important principle of German foreign policy since, you know, the 1940s, 1950s. Sometimes to a fault. In the early winter of 1979, there was a vote at the United Nations about who would get to represent the Khmer Rouge who would get to represent Cambodia at the UN. And there was a fight between the Khmer Rouge and the new government that the Vietnamese had installed. And the United States and China and West Germany all voted for the Khmer Rouge. And I asked Schmidt about that. I wanted to ask, there must be something about German foreign ministers that they don't respond to emails, but I wanted to ask Genscher as well this, you know, why? And basically Schmidt said to me, you know, that he had enough problems with Carter as it was. And again, you know, he emphasized this fact that German interests, West German interests, were centered in Europe at the time of the Soviets. I don't find that to be a cop-out. I do understand. I do understand the response. Yeah, of course, yeah. As far as Biafra goes, it's great. I could have included Biafra. I suppose I have two weak responses to that. The first is that somebody else has written on Yeah, there's a book by Lassa Hatta. If you're interested, I can give you the title. But it's about Western responses to the Biafra crisis. And he talks about just what you talked about, that those images now of babies dying, that began with the Biafra War. So that was one reason I didn't write on Biafra. Also because, I mean, I kind of hesitate to say this, but you know, the jury's still out about whether or not that was a genocide. And okay, but I did encounter somebody in the archives and outside the archive. I didn't get to meet him; he was dead by this point. But Habit Chaya, do you know that name? Yeah, of course. Yeah, Chaya was a refugee from the East. Known as a conservative firebrand, had been the head of the expellee organizations in Germany. He got very involved in Biafra. He was really instrumental in going down there and bringing humanitarian aid. Religious reasons played a role, right? There was a Catholic minority. That was. Chaya was also instrumental in bringing Cambodian refugees. But again, I'm not trying to somehow diminish what he did, but there were also political reasons there, right? They weren't just refugees, they were refugees fleeing a communist country. In other words, they were the right refugees. When it came to, say, the refugees, leftist refugees from Chile, who were fleeing Pinochet, there was a completely different response. So, thank you.
I actually think I might have a question for you.
Okay.
If you, and so again, this is very much not my area. I'm going to draw two things. So I just recently just watched a short documentary and learned about the 19th century genocide in Namibia that was carried out by the German Empire. And my understanding is that the descendants of Germans who still live there, you know, they're a minority. And, you know, things have probably changed since this documentary came out. I think it's about 20 years old. But it's still very like this conservative, like this, you know, we were kind of in the right to enter this place and commit this genocide. And we're honoring our ancestors in doing that. And there's really, like the United States, there's a lot of reluctance to look at the past and kind of acknowledge. And one of the things this documentary also said was that concentration type camps were also set up there. And so that was kind of an early model. And I kind of think about like the way you're talking about German responses to these crises that are happening in foreign lands. And I think about that Namibia kind of example and the example in the United States where a very strong impulse on the behalf of many Americans, even many anti-slavery Americans right after the Civil War, was to send enslaved people back, quote unquote, to Africa. And kind of like, we almost can't face like being in the same society with these people, or if we live amongst them, we can't acknowledge what happened. So I wonder if kind of sort of like living amongst the people versus responding to a crisis that's happening in a foreign land. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but just in terms of the way the United States has responded to its atrocities versus the way that Germany responded to its 20th century atrocities.
Yeah, I mean, that opens up a whole can of worms, which I brought upon myself because of, you know, what I also say in the talk about conservatives in Germany as opposed to conservatives or most conservatives here. I presented on the book in July at the Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills, and a woman who was a Holocaust survivor stood up and asked me what I thought about reparations for African Americans. It was kind of, you know, I mean, I was very careful in my response because I don't know enough about the issue to say whether or not I think that that would be the best response. But what I will say is this: I am amazed at at the response in the United States to people who say, well, that happened so long ago, let's put that behind us, how they would respond if they heard Germans saying that today. Oh, well, you know, what happened to the Jews is so long ago, let's forget about it. And in fact, at another talk that I gave, there was a woman in the audience who was, I should just say this, the Holocaust survivor. It turned out she was in favor of reparations. A few weeks ago, I gave a presentation also in the area, and there was a woman who was the child of Holocaust survivors and had been born in a DP camp, a displaced person camp, in the late 1940s. And that was her response when we talked about reparations, because that also came up, and she said, "Oh, that was so long ago," which I won't say I found it shocking necessarily, but I found it disappointing as a certainly as a response. I mean, again, if mainstream German politicians would say some of the things that our mainstream politicians say about our past, you know what the headlines would be like in venues like the New York Times, and and I find it very hypocritical. I'm not collapsing distinctions here. I'm not saying the industrialized mass murder of 6 million people because of their religion is the same as 400 years of slavery. I don't want to enter into that debate. But I certainly, personally, I wish there were a little more understanding, a little more willingness here to confront that past. What I don't understand is, most of you here probably will remember this, when the miniseries Roots came out in the 1970s. I think it was in 77. It came out about a year and a half before Holocaust. And I remember I was about 10 at the time, and I just was devastated by this. And many people I knew were as well. Families being ripped apart, children taken from their mothers, and I find it interesting to ask why there was not the same kind of sustained emotional reaction here that you had in Germany. You, in your question, might have provided a response to that, and that is that the descendants of the slaves are still here, and there have been so many tensions still that there is perhaps less of a willingness in certain quarters to deal with that because of the extent of what the Germans did in the 1940s. That's not the case there.
Thank you very much for this talk. It's very, very interesting. One of my mentors, I'm a psychoanalyst, one of my teachers was a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
He also did a lot of research on the effect on Holocaust survivors from their experience during the war. This is Henry Crystal. You may know his work, but I talked to him at one point about how he felt about Germans, and he said that he felt the problem is that in all these situations, there's not enough emphasis on the fact that these are potentials that all human beings have to do what the Germans did, to do what we did in Vietnam, to what what happened in Rwanda, DRC, many different situations. And his point is that there needs to be, and I wonder if there's any discussion of this in Germany now, when you talk about coming to terms with these things, of dehumanization, of the fact that we all have some very untamed drives. As a psychoanalyst, drives are important things that I study with my patients every day. But we all have them, and under the right or wrong circumstances, these can erupt and cause mayhem and disaster. But I just wonder, in general, about the kind of world awareness of this issue.
Yeah.
And whether there's, what's really interesting about your talk is that these experiences that Germans had to be of help to other places where similar things were happening helped them have insight into themselves to some extent.
Right.
Of course, I wonder now about what's happened in terms of the rise of fascism throughout Europe and in Germany as well.
Yeah.
But whether that's something that's been you found in any of your interviews is part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that. It would be very delicate for a German to make the points that you just made in this context, because they would be accused of somehow relativizing what had happened in Germany. I mean, I think, if I put my philosopher hat on or the psychoanalyst, we can all agree that these are expressions of human drives and the darker side of human nature. But, as a historian, my job is to explain why certain events happened when and where they did. And I'm always, I'm always a bit careful with whataboutism, and I'm not saying you're doing that. Many historians, I'm afraid, do. Many pundits do. I don't think it's our job to, but I think your essential point is certainly a correct one. This came up in interviews. I guess what I would say is it's very difficult for me to prove in an evidentiary way, in some sort of empirical way, that the genocides that happened in other countries influenced how Germans thought about their own past. But I found hints in the way, and I spent a lot of time talking about language and the words that they choose. And it seems to me quite clear that subconsciously, right, and if there's some sort of effect. But, as a historian, I only have a blunt instrument or blunt instruments for getting at that. But in general, it's a very important point. Thank you.
So as someone who is in a generation in the United States where we're very much trying to come to terms with the past in a way that's receiving a lot of backlash, I was really struck by the part where you say you have to find ways to balance those two, to come to terms with the past, but also not create this huge backlash. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to do that in a way that where you're not sacrificing your own values for the sake of not creating people
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and it's how I end the book, talking about that, right? We also have to pick up on the negative lessons of the Germans, because there's been a lot of nasty back and forth in Germany as well about these issues. I don't see the purpose that it serves. To me, trying to understand the other person's position, even if it's abhorrent to you, trying to at least, see where they're coming from. If somebody says, I'm sick and tired of hearing about the Holocaust, or I'm sick and tired of hearing about slavery, 10 years ago, maybe, my reaction would have been, kind of huffy and, I don't want to talk to this person. And maybe it's a question of getting older and more mellow, but now I just think it makes sense to try to, okay, why do you say that? Why do you think that way? Could you not see, could you understand? But if that woman who said to me, slavery, that's 400 years in the past, I didn't want to say this to her in public because I didn't want to put her on the spot, but I think if we were sitting and having a coffee somewhere, I would have said, well, could you imagine if somebody said that about what happened to your parents? How would you respond? So it's getting away from screaming nastiness, scoring political points, and really just trying to have a civil discussion with people about these issues, no matter how far apart you are. And I know, the difficulty is, how do you deal with hate speech? All of us have points where we just will refuse to engage with somebody. Where that is depends on different people. So, sorry, it's not as if I think anything goes, but calm, collected, rational discussion. Call me old-fashioned, but I still think there's a place for that in our society.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more.
Thank you, Andrew, for the talk and the introduction to your book. You talked to many Germans about their reactions to genocide. Did you also talk to people in the areas of genocide that you explored, how they reacted to other foreign countries' reactions to the genocide?
No. Next question. No, no, I didn't. I didn't. I think it wouldn't have been a bad idea. I mean, I was interested, of course, more in how Germans, what they thought, but there were times where there were some people I would love to have spoken with. This book that I showed. No, hold on. This one here, Holocaust in Cambodia. I visited this woman in northern Germany, and she's really fascinating. She went to one of the refugee camps and wrote the story of a family that had all directions in it, perpetrators and victims. I mean, it's really, and she published this in the Spiegel as a two-part series. And in a sense, it was kind of like what the miniseries Holocaust did, trying to describe these atrocities through the lens of a single family. But that's not why I mention it. Why I mention it is because she wound up becoming very close with this family and brought back members who are still there today, still thriving. One of her neighbors also took in some. So I would like to have spoken with them to ask them questions like, did Germans ask you about your experience there? What was that like? But I didn't. After 15 years, I just thought I have to wrap this up. But no, that would have been a very nice balance. Can I, Helmut? I saw you had a question. Could we take one more, or is that? Unless it's a difficult one, because you.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't know how to ask this question, because you know about this question more than I do, and that's why I turned to you. And it's about a recent debate among the people who think about memory, and it pertains to Michael Rothberg's argument about multidirectional memory, which basically sort of calls for a memory that links the Holocaust with other crimes, sort of atrocities. And what was interesting about the debate in Germany was the fact that it was heavily, heavily criticized. And from what you are telling us, sort of you would assume that there's a certain openness, sort of to making these kinds of connections. And so I have maybe unformed ideas about why that sort of, critique of multidirectional memory of the atrocious past was so heavily criticized in Germany, but I would like to hear your take.
Yeah, there's of course a fear in Germany, you'll know this better than I do, especially on the left, that any comparisons will lead to a relativization of the Holocaust. And Rothberg is making just the opposite point. And to be honest, I think his argument's kind of a banal one, that bringing that it's not a zero-sum game when one talks about the suffering of others, but in fact, when you bring them in conjunction with one another, that it can shed light on other suffering. I think it's the way it's sometimes done. Well, what about the Palestinians? We're sick and tired of hearing about the Jews, and that's been an important point in the debate. So I think that's what's going on there. I don't want to say I don't understand the reaction, because I do, and I don't think it's entirely wrong, right? That fear, where is this going to? I wrote a piece about that. I don't know if you know this. In response to this catechism controversy debate, I wrote a piece called "The Wrath of Moses," and one of the things I argue in there is that so many of these debates are not about what we're talking about at the moment or what's on the paper, but about subtexts and fears about where.
It's just
okay. Well, I guess
the library is closing in 15 minutes. So.
Okay. I lost the thread. Sorry. Wrath of Moses. Oh, yeah, that's so much, thank you. That so much of this is about fears of what people are saying between the lines. So if you somehow talk about other groups suffering, that the intention, the unstated intention, is to somehow take away from the suffering of the Jews or other groups. And you can't prove that or disprove that, but I think that's what's going on there, this concern about subtexts. And, you look at the debate between Friedlander and Groschat, where Friedlander, who is a Israeli-French historian, argues that you cannot look at Nazi Germany as a normal historical occurrence, that it's somehow outside of history. I understand that as a moral argument, right? I don't understand it as an argument by a serious historian. Every human event can be historicized and put into context. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. So Literati has copies of the book for sale out in the vestibule, and can have a very speedy signing over at this table here. Thank you all so much for coming out
Thank you,
tonight.
Emily.